So I have beaten both Lords of the Fallen and Lies of P about 5 times, whether it be using different builds, going into New Game Plus, or beating the game at level 1. So I actually do feel like I am qualified to make this video. We are going to have a bunch of different categories, 9 in total, and have them fight each other and see which one ends up with the most points. Now we can have a little class activity as well for the people that have played and beaten the game. Just let me know down in the comments what your final score is. Now one thing I also want to mention before I do get started is that both games actually have amazing support. The developers are actually listening to a lot of the feedback for the players themselves, and they're actually constantly updating the game every now and then. So by the time they actually might watch this video, whether it be a few months from now, the game might be in a different state. But it is very nice to know that both games are actually getting changed for the better. Now please, for the love of God, don't just skip towards the end of the video looking at the final score thinking that actually means anything, because what I'm saying throughout the video is what actually is going to have merit. And this video is made for the people that are unsure as to which one to buy. So if you're a person that values things like level design, bosses, or quality of life, you might lean more towards one game than the other. But if you're a person that doesn't really value those things, then you're probably going to like the other game. Because at the end of the day, liking something is completely subjective, and we also shouldn't gatekeep these things as well. Cool, we got it? Awesome. Let's get started. Okay, now starting off with level design. Now when I talk about level design, I'm specifically talking about the areas themselves, not the entire game and how it all interconnects. Now with the level design for both games actually is pretty linear. It is like one set narrow path from boss to boss, but both games do have a nice amount of branching paths that do offer some nice exploration and rewards. Now one thing that I actually do appreciate about both games is that every single room and section does actually look different to the last. There's rarely moments where I actually walk in a room and it looks very similar and I end up getting lost. Now Lies of P doesn't really innovate with its level design as it is pretty traditional, but it did perfect the interconnected level by having all these well-designed shortcuts that lead back to the Stargazer. And they also have a healthy amount of Stargazers as well, so it feels very nice to just progress from area to area with no backtracking. And coupled with a nice amount of enemies that are well placed, it feels like a really smooth combat experience to just clear out the area, do some nice exploration with little to no frustration. Now with Lords of the Fallen though, they actually really did innovate in terms of the level design by adding a second world. They actually added the Umbra world to where you actually die, where you actually can manually teleport there to have a whole separate experience in the level design. Now this is actually pretty cool because having two separate areas means it actually adds extra elements to exploration, and for them specifically actually allowed them to add more puzzles in the areas as well. Now unfortunately, you don't really benefit much by being in the regular world, as most of the exploration and all the secrets are hidden in the Umbra world, because the way that it stands right now is that the regular world is kind of like your easy mode. You have an extra life, less enemies, but you also get less rewards, whereas the Umbra world is the harder version with just more rewards. But being that in most cases you kind of have to be in the Umbra world just to progress through the area, it doesn't really offer you much of a choice. I wish there was both different experiences with their own secrets, own enemies, which can actually be another issue. All the enemies in the regular world can actually be in the Umbra world at the exact same time. So there's plenty of times to when you just die, you get teleported to the Umbral, and then you just get overwhelmed by a bunch of enemies, and you're kind of just forced to run away. I just wish they were completely separate, which could actually still work because the harder enemies are actually still in the Umbra world, so it still will make for the harder experience. And in terms of the puzzles, they're actually very basic. They kind of just served as random obstacles to just extend the playtime. And another small complaint that I do have is that the Umbra world kind of just all looks the exact same. It's kind of hard to navigate. It's not as easy or as fluid as it is with just the regular world. But if I were to talk about just the level design itself outside of the secondary world, it is very similar to Lies of P in terms of its well-designed shortcuts, but it is not as good, as there are some shortcuts that are just completely useless. And also the game's level design is actually balanced around you creating your own checkpoints, as there aren't many vestiges throughout the world, which I'm actually okay with if they actually allowed you to have more than one checkpoint up at a time, which they don't. So overall, Lords of the Fallen is really good, and I'm happy that they actually did innovate and change things up, but Lies of P was just a masterclass in level design. Getting into the world design. Now this is actually going to be a pretty broad category, as it does cover the overall vibe and atmosphere of the game, as well as how the world all connects and progresses. Now starting off with Lies of P, it's extremely linear. It's just one area after the other, which can be fine because it's like impossible to fuck up or get lost. But it could still be an issue in terms of build creation, because instead of having 20 weapons open to you at the beginning, you only have 5. Now this isn't much of an issue on your first playthrough, but if you have the second or third, you're definitely going to wish you had more freedoms. Now the world itself does actually interconnect really well. Playing the entire first half of the game and seeing it all wrap back around to the start is honestly insane. Now, unfortunately, the second half doesn't really do this as well. I've ever heard that one before, but it doesn't really mean much, as you can just teleport anywhere. Now, one criticism I actually do have as well is that a lot of the areas do look very similar. It's just one dull dark area leading into the next dull dark area, which I guess does fit the theme of the game itself. And being that actually has more of a realistic setting, it does make more sense compared to the fantasy setting of Lords of the Fallen. But just for me personally, I do prefer to see a more diverse color palette. As for the overall vibe of the game though, it is just phenomenal. The game has such great character to it. The NPCs are very well made. The environmental storytelling with how the enemies can interact is really good. And sometimes it's just the little things that just really make this game stand out.
Close your eyes, come to me.
Now, as for Lords of the Fallen, this game is not as linear. You have a bunch more areas accessible to you for exploration earlier on, which once again is great for build creation. However, in Lords of the Fallen, it isn't the most intuitive in terms of progression, as you'll get like a random key sometimes, and you'll be left like, okay, now which of the thousands locked doors does this one unlock? But something that actually does really well in is having a bunch of these like beacons that are lit up in the sky to actually try and tell you where you actually should be going next. It actually is a very good form of environmental storytelling. And another thing is that every single area looks extremely different to the last, which obviously does differ a lot from Lies of P. Just like traversing from a snow area to a lava area that goes into like some deep underground area, it actually is really cool. But in terms of the overall vibe, it is actually pretty nice. It's very dark and depressing like Lies of P. However, in Lies of P, it does feel a little bit more creepy and nuanced, whereas in this game, it feels like everyone is just fucking pissed off, which honestly, I can get behind. I respect that, but I feel like this was just done better in Lies of P. So overall, in terms of world design, I prefer the freedoms in Lords of the Fallen, but I prefer the overall vibe of Lies of P. So honestly, I'll just give this one a tie. I probably should have separated these things, but you guys get the idea. Getting into the graphics and art design, both of these games do it extremely well. It is just going to be very subjective as to what type of art style you do prefer. For me personally, I just tend to prefer a more medieval setting, so I actually might lean more towards Lords of the Fallen. Actually does get some very decent variety as well. You can get some of this amazing scenery with the cool medieval fantasy castles, or you can get some like extremely like just weird hellish scenes as well. And just progressing through the overworld in Lords of the Fallen, you end up getting this much more grand visuals. But things that Lies of P actually does do better in my opinion is facial animations. They just look a lot better. The cutscenes are also a lot better. And I just feel like the animation quality in general just feels much more smooth and not really as jank as it does feel in Lords of the Fallen sometimes. But for me on this one, I'm actually going to lean more towards Lords of the Fallen because those visuals are insane. Bosses and enemies. Now, both games have just flawless boss and enemy art designs. They just like look really cool, have really cool animations as well. So yeah, in terms of design, there's like nothing bad I can say about them. 10 out of 10. But unfortunately, it kind of just ends there in terms of the balance because Lies of P just clears in terms of enemies. They're just way more nuanced. They have way more cool and unique interactions, whether it be deflecting the weapon and having it get snapped in half, or even the most basic enemies having like a rabid beast for a second phase. Whereas in Lords of the Fallen, it feels like a lot of the enemies are just way more basic and don't really have much nuance to their movesets at all. Because the way I feel is actually balanced is that in Lies of P, is that you have not many enemies throughout the overworld, but they're just more difficult and more challenging to fight against. Whereas in Lords of the Fallen, they're more basic, but there's just way more enemies, which in my opinion, I'd rather just fight the few enemies that are actually challenging instead of just a clusterfuck of just basic bitches, not gonna lie. And also, Lies of P just adds like new enemies in almost every single area. You either go up against like a new mini boss or just a new group of enemies, and obviously this makes the whole game feel a lot more fresh, whereas in Lords of the Fallen, they kind of introduce like all their enemies right at the beginning, and just kind of just use them throughout the entirety of the game. Some areas do change it up a little bit, but for the most part, they're exactly the same, especially like the last few areas. They don't really have any new enemies at all. Like every single area just has a dog for some reason. And in terms of the bosses, this one's just not close as well. Lords of the Fallen bosses are just incredibly basic. Some of them are actually really cool and fun to fight against, but their quality of bosses feel like it's very dated. They feel like the Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 era of bosses and how basic they actually feel. Whereas Lies of P definitely feels very modernized. Definitely feels like I'm playing like next-gen Souls-like bosses, because they're all like really complicated and they're actually really challenging as well, which is what they should be, which in Lords of the Fallen isn't really like that. They're pretty easy. There was plenty of times where I just like walk up to the boss, especially in my first playthrough, and just first tried the boss, which should not be happening, especially with how challenging it actually is to get to the boss itself. Like clearing out the area is such an arduous and hellish task, and the boss is just a cakewalk, which I'm just not too big of a fan of. Now, obviously this is a bit more subjective. It actually might differ from person to person, but for me, I'd rather have difficult bosses and not as annoying and difficult areas to go through. But if you want to know more of my opinions on the Lies of P bosses themselves, I have a whole dedicated video ranking all of them. So if you want to know my opinions specifically, you can go check that out. But I really like them. Next up, I want to talk about build creation. Now, I did want to label this build variety. However, Lords of the Fallen is like very deliberately going for good build creation and good build variety. And the other in Lies of P is deliberately not going for that, because Lies of P build creation is literally just the weapon itself, and that is it. Just being able to like mix and match the hilts and the blades, which is an amazing concept by the way, to try and find like the perfect weapon combinations for movesets and weapon skills. It's really cool, but the reason why I say it doesn't have much build variety outside of that is because every single build just feels the exact same. I've done playthroughs with Motility, Technique, and Advance, and every build just feels the same. And it's purely because that you can just keep on mix and matching different types of hilts with blades, with almost every single type of build, and with using cranks you could pretty much just have the exact same weapons for all the builds, which is deliberate on their part because they actually want to make it to where you're just constantly changing up your weapon depending on what area you're actually going into. They just want you to constantly experiment and just use different types of stuff, which is just true because the game just throws a whole bunch of upgrade materials at you to just have all your weapons just be upgraded basically. And another reason as to why this is true is because there's no requirements. There's like no requirements for anything. You can just use whatever the fuck you want at all times. And even with Legion arms, it's kind of the exact same thing. Most of them kind of work the exact same way in that they're just like different versions of projectiles. But like depending on what area you're going through or depending on what boss you're fighting, you'd actually want to go with a different type of Legion arm. And with how stats actually work in this game, you don't really benefit much of actually going to level up an attribute stat compared to some of the other games. So using a Legion arm with any type of build is still going to be very viable. Now, another thing that actually enhances the build creation of Liza P is going to be the P organ, the skill tree system, which skill trees don't really offer much in terms of build variety because you can just like max them all out and they're not really like limited in any way. So like inherently they're just not going to be as good for build variety. But obviously all the really cool perks and stuff like that you can acquire from the skill tree definitely enhances the creation of the build itself. But yeah, the entire build variety of Liza P is just the weapons. There's 40 in total. Every single one does get its own unique moveset, and they all get 2 different weapon skills as well, one for the hilt and one for the blade. And most of these skills are actually unique, which if you guys did want to know, compared to Lords of the Fallen, it has 145 weapons, which is 100 more weapons than Liza P, and that only gets 15 different movesets and no weapon skills. Roughly 15, but that's still kind of crazy. So that's kind of an L on Lords of the Fallen part. I wish I did have some more movesets, but thankfully, they actually have more going for it, because every single type of build does have its own range and projectile-based options. Even with like your strength and dexterity-based builds, they have the options of throwable objects, bows, and crossbows, and these things actually do work the exact same way as spells do, and they just replenish. They're not finite at all, which is an amazing concept. I've always wanted that in the Souls games. Please, From Software, do that. And the spells themselves are actually really cool as well. Every spell type does offer 20 different types of spells. There's a bunch of them that give you some really cool buffs, and there's a bunch of really good damaging and support type spells as well. So already the build variety of Lords of the Fallen just from that alone is better, but I wouldn't say the build creation is as good until you actually go ahead and use things like the runes and the lamp sockets, because runes are kind of like your blood gems. You can just equip them onto your weapons, even your shield, which is something else I haven't even mentioned. You can actually do shielded combat or power stance or two-handed. But the runes though are actually really nice additions to your build itself, because some of these things can add really nice perks to like your damage or your status effect build up or health regen. And then when it comes to your lamp socket, it kind of works very similar in how the runes do work. They just add some more effects and perks to your build itself, whether it just be some like more health regen in Umbral form, more damage to soul form, just adding another soul flay charge as well. One thing I also forgot to mention is the rings or amulets in Liza P. I just feel like the Lords of the Fallen rings are just way more fleshed out than the amulets are in Liza P, especially when you include the pendants as well. Because there's plenty of cool stuff out there for like stamina regen, health regen, boosting damage, but there's also really cool unique stuff out there like being able to proc one status effect and it just inherently procs another one for free, or being able to cast different sorceries with the wrong catalyst. Also just makes build creation and min-maxing just amazing. So although the cool and unique interesting stuff you can do with your build in Lords of the Fallen, you can like definitely min-max the fuck out of your build and just create the most broken ass stuff and just melt shit really quickly, where I feel like you can't really do that in Liza P. You still can really make some cool combinations, but the min-maxing potential, stacking buffs, finding the correct runes, equipping the correct lamp sockets, I just feel like that concept enhances the build creation a lot more. Combat. Okay, listen up. This will be the most important thing you guys will ever hear in your entire lives. This is very important. Everybody needs to know about this. Combat in the Souls games has very little to do with your player character's abilities. Obviously, it has some importance, but what the Souls formula actually is, and what From Software innovated, or like re-innovated, I don't know, that's probably not the word, who cares? But they shifted the attention from the player character to the enemy or boss, which means that the combat is memorizing boss movesets and then reacting accordingly. Now this is the reason as to why we can just do nothing but spam the exact same button throughout the entire playthrough and it won't feel boring or stale, because every single time you fight a new enemy, it's a new experience. Look at a game like Sekiro, it's hailed as like the king of combat. All you're doing is clicking the L1 button. But why is it good? Because look at this shit. It's flawless. It's amazing. Now the deflect mechanic does have a lot to do with this, but the point of which I'm trying to make is that it doesn't matter how good your combat system is. If your enemies and bosses suck, your combat's gonna suck. But being that we already talked about bosses and enemies, we're just gonna separate that and purely talk about the combat system. Now both of these games have a very similar combat system. Both get that same hunter dodge, the dodge roll and locked off. They both get a deflect mechanic, a poise breaking mechanic. They both can take partial damage when blocking. You can actually end up getting that health back when you do damage back yourself. And when staggering an enemy, you have to do a charged heavy attack to complete the posture break. They pretty much all work the exact same way, but the main difference is that Lords of the Fallen is just way more forgiving in all of those areas. You just get more iframes with your dodge, you can like sprint faster, you can roll further, your deflect frames are just way more forgiving as well. And you're not just limited to just using a charged heavy to get the posture break, you could also kick or parry. And in terms of getting your health back after blocking, in Liza P, it just gradually goes down over time. Whereas in Lords of the Fallen, as long as you're not taking damage, that withering effect is actually never going to go down. And you can actually never die while blocking as well, because you just take no partial damage. Whereas in Liza P, you actually can take partial damage, depending on the build that is. One thing I actually completely forgot about is that Lords of the Fallen doesn't actually get any backstabs at all, where Liza P actually does, even though it is actually somewhat inconsistent decent, but Lords of the Fallen not having backstabs, or traditional backstabs at least, is definitely disheartening because it just makes combat flow a lot nicer, especially when you're trying to get ganked by 1,000 different smaller enemies. But looking at other things that the games do offer, Lords of the Fallen does actually have like, spells and ranged options and projectiles that are a lot more fleshed out than the range and projectile options that Liza P has. But one thing that Liza P does get is a bunch of cool perks via the skill tree. Now, unfortunately, there are some like really like good perks that you feel like they should be part of the base kit that are tied behind the skill tree, like being able to roll when you're just knocked down to the ground. Okay, I just want to chime in really quick because actually was just a live stream today and the developers did actually say they were going to fix this issue and actually might come around about later this month. Or getting someone back with that guard regain health back when you deflect. But at least it's better than what you get in Lords of the Fallen because every single time that you deflect, you still take a bit of chip damage, which is just like that withering damage, but it's still kind of annoying. And another perk on the skill tree, not being able to take durability damage when you deflect is also something that should be just part of the base kit. I just hate durability in general, like in every single game. I don't know why they have to implement it into this one. Now, thankfully, it is like a little bit more fleshed out and actually is a cooler mechanic and it is easily countered in Liza P, but I still don't like it. So with all that being said, I feel like that Lords of the Fallen just has more upsides in terms of its combat system. But once again, bosses and enemies is most important. But I guess Lords of the Fallen can get the win on this one. Performance! Yeah, this is Liza P. This is not even close. Liza P is just like perfected. Haven't like encountered any bugs in that game. I think it's crashed on me like once in my hundreds of hours of playing. No frame drops. It just runs so fucking perfectly. Cannot say the same about Lords of the Fallen. I'm pretty sure everyone knows about it as well. I've played it on both PS5. I've played it on PC as well. I have never had an experience where I've had 60 FPS for like longer than like 30 seconds straight, which for me, it's not like the biggest deal in the world. I've played Bloodborne, but unfortunately the problems don't just end there. There's still a bunch of random crashes, weird texture bugs, clipping issues, which thankfully they actually are improving on every day or every other day. It feels like they're just adding a new patch for this bunch of bug fixes and improving performance, which is nice. And hopefully like maybe like months from now, it ends up being somewhat decent. But at the moment, the performance is just not good and it should not have been released in this state. Okay, getting into replayability. Now, replayability is basically just the PvP and New Game Plus. Now, being that Liza P has 0 online and Lords of the Fallen online is as complete dog shit. The servers are like worse than From Software somehow. Pretty sure the PvP is like already dead. So with that being said, I think nobody wins that one. By getting into the New Game Plus, for Lords of the Fallen, thankfully, they had an update to where they actually had the enemies not be complete bullshit, and they actually added some of the vestiges back as well. Because they had the intelligent idea when they made the game to not actually have any vestiges, which are your checkpoints, throughout any part of New Game Plus, which makes it just beyond unplayable and just completely obnoxious to play through. But thankfully now in New Game Plus, you actually have some of them back. Once you get to New Game Plus 2 and 3, you're basically going to have none left. And the New Game Plus itself doesn't really change up anything. It's pretty much the exact same game, just like way harder. But one thing that actually does do though, is that when you get one of the endings of the games, it actually does unlock a new starting class to which you can like play through with that, which I guess only really affects the early game because some of the stuff that you actually get isn't really that far into the game anyway. So I guess the only purpose to replay Lords of the Fallen is to probably try out some of the other new builds that you haven't tried out before, which can be good because you can make really fun builds with every single type. But like if you already played the game with like a Radiance and Inferno based build, then you pretty much did everything. So you're basically playing the game to get the Umbral ending, because if you didn't get the Umbral ending, then every other ending's final boss is just absolutely terrible. So yeah, the replayability lies behind the build variety in the game. As for Liza P, obviously no online. The New Game Plus once again doesn't really change up much except for just enemies hitting a lot harder, and they do hit a lot harder. But thankfully, your skill tree actually does get an extended pod. It gets a phase 6 in New Game Plus and a phase 7 in New Game Plus 2, which is actually really cool because like some of the best perks are actually tied behind those, and these actually really enhance the combat and make the New Game Plus and Plus 2 experience at least somewhat bearable because they can be really hard. So for me, I'm just gonna go based on what I actually enjoyed to replay the most. And for me, it was Liza P. I liked the New Game Plus better. It was purely because like at least I had bonfires and I had something to look forward to and new upgrades. Whereas in Lords of the Fallen, it was just like testing out new builds. But I did replay both games at level 1 and both were actually really enjoyable playthroughs. And ironically, my favorite playthrough of Lords of the Fallen was actually my level 1 run because the game can be so stingy with like the vigor, which is basically like your souls or runes. And you always have to like spend them on like leveling up, but you also have to buy a whole bunch of materials, buying some mana stones and things like that. But when I had my level 1 run, I didn't have to worry about leveling up at all. I just spent all the stuff that I wanted to buy. All the materials, all the ammunition pouches. It was really fun. And min-maxing a level 1 run is really cool as well. So I feel that Lords of the Fallen has more play in terms of challenge runs out there, but Liza P has more incentive and replayability, so I don't know. I'd probably just give this one to Liza P. Okay, now getting into quality of life, this one is just not even close. It's probably just as much of a discrepancy as the performance-based one, because Lies of P just clears so much. I'm just going to list like 10 things that Lies of P does better, then I'll list like about the few things that Lords of the Fallen does better in terms of quality of life. If I'm missing anything, just let me know down in the comments. But one thing that Lords of the Fallen does not do well is that a lot of NPC questlines are extremely sensitive. You just like enter one area, then all of a sudden they're just dead, or they'll teleport, then you just miss out on a whole bunch of really good items and like the best spells. And to get the best ending in the game, it involves you having to kill the blacksmith, which the blacksmith sells like all the upgrade materials that you need, some of the best stuff. Obviously, socketing your runes, upgrading your weapon. Now, there's like somebody else's questline you actually can do to counteract this, but if you fuck up their questline, that means you just have the whole end game not being able to upgrade your weapon or being able to buy upgrade materials. Whereas in Lies of P, there's nothing like that. All the items are very easy to obtain, and none of the important items are tied behind very sensitive NPC questlines. Next quality of life change is infinite respec. You can infinitely respec in Lies of P very easily. Don't even have to farm for nothing. All you gotta do is just like play the game. And you can also like respec your skill tree, respec how much you actually level up your Legion arm. Whereas in Lords of the Fallen, you can like respec like 4 times per playthrough because you have to like get certain types of items. I hate not having infinite respec in these Souls games. It's even stupid in Elden Ring. Next, actually having a damage testing area. In the hub world, there's literally an area to test out your damage, which is just flawless. Every single Souls game should have this. Lords of the Fallen does not. Number 4, resetting elevators. In Lies of P, you don't even have to send the elevator up or down. It just automatically resets depending on where you are. But in Lords of the Fallen, not only does it not even automatically reset, but you can't even send it back up or down. Please, it's like one little quality of life update. Number 5, having the Ergo drop outside of the boss arena is like incredibly huge. So when you die to the boss, it just drops your souls outside, that you can just pick them up without even entering the boss room. What a fantastic luxury. Number 6, it tells you where the NPCs actually are. The icons will just light up in the Stargazer HUD, and it'll tell you exactly who you need to talk to, at what time. You just go there, talk to the NPC. It just makes doing the quest lines so intuitive and so nice. Don't have to resort to like looking up guides, looking up YouTube videos, which 90% of the people end up doing anyway. So I don't know why the game just doesn't want to just do it themselves. Number 7, infinite use homeward bone. If you don't know what a homeward bone is, it's an item which you use that can teleport you back to the latest checkpoints or back to the hub world. And you literally get this item right at the beginning of the game. It's so nice to have. It just saves having to run all the way back to the Stargazer. There's so many times you have to go back to the hub world. It's just so cool to have. Whereas in Lords of the Fallen, not only are these items very finite, you can't even go choose the option to teleport back to the hub. And these items are actually hard to acquire. Like you have to farm these things off like very annoying enemies. And if you want to purchase them, they're very expensive as well. Which, speaking of which, getting into number 8, the economy is such a problem in Lords of the Fallen. You just don't get much vigor of things, and things that is incredibly expensive. If you want to upgrade your weapons, it just costs so much. Like getting one weapon to like plus 10 costs like 30,000 vigor, which like end game bosses don't even drop that much. It costs so much to buy upgrade materials because the game just doesn't give you enough. So you have to just do constant farming all the time. I've never had to farm a single time in Lies of P. But on Lords of the Fallen, I'm doing nothing but farming. Just so I can just buy the most simple or basic of things. In Lies of P, this gives you all the Ergo in the world to just buy all the materials, upgrade your weapon very easily. You can easily upgrade like about 7 or 8 weapons to max in Lies of P, even though there's only 40 weapons. There's over 140 weapons in Lords of the Fallen, and you can only get 4 weapons to max. And you have to upgrade multiple things because sometimes you want a power stance or even upgrade a catalyst. So the fact that it only gives you the ability to actually max out like 4 items is very silly. Number 9, rechargeable pulse cells. When you actually run out of pulse cells, you can just do damage or just kill enemies to end up getting some of that pulse cell charge back. There's so many times where you just like run out of pulse cells, but like it just ends up clutching up, and it makes a nice sound as well to tell you they end up getting a pulse cell back. It just makes combat feel so nice and very rewarding at the same time. And then number 10, you don't have to farm for shit in Lies of P. Every single weapon is a guaranteed drop of something. You pick it up out of a chest. All the important items are as well. You don't have to farm for anything in that game. It's so great. I don't know why all the Souls-like games or FromSoft games in general, they always feel the need to have you farm for stuff, especially when they have so many weapons and armor as well. And they won't even be like very forgiving drop rates. They'll be like 1%, 2% drop rates. Now, thankfully in Lords of the Fallen, there actually are ways to get like some nice guaranteed drops with the runes, but I think farming is pretty silly. But getting into the quality of life changes that Lords of the Fallen does really well. 1, interchanging the spells. Now, obviously, I know Lies of P doesn't have any spells, but I still want to talk about it because it is really cool. Being able to just switch your spells on the fly is just so nice. Number 2, leveling up at the bonfire. You can't really do that in Lies of P until like at the end of the playthrough or in New Game Plus, which is unfortunate. And number 3, armor dye. You can like dye your armor. I guess that's it. If there's any other quality of life changes I'm missing, please let me know down in the comments. We can discuss it there. Anyway, that pretty much concludes it for that one. This is the final score. As always, this is not a good representation as to what game is actually better. Depending on what category is actually important to you, will be dependent on which game you actually might like the best. For me, the categories at Lies of P 1 at 10 to be the ones that I like the most. So for me, it's not even close. Lies of P is like the way better game. But for you, it might be different. But do let me know what your scores are down below in the comments. And please do like and subscribe as well. You have to like and subscribe. If you don't, I'll literally start crying and shitting and pissing.